one thing that I want to sort of start with is how the events of the last month have changed, maybe challenged our views of how politics functions, of how the government's role in our society and our economy. Those have been challenged, although of course they are refracted by our pre-existing beliefs. And I use this quote from Martin Wolf, who's a columnist at the Financial Times: "No event better demonstrates why a quality administrative state led by people able to differentiate experts from charlatans is so vital to the public." And I think that that's exactly right. And the emphasis here is on the administrative state, which of course includes the bureaucracy as we think of it is, the federal government in Washington, D.C., but it's also broader than that, right? It is about absorbing the capabilities throughout this country or any country, right? But the capabilities of government at federal, state, city levels, and its ability to interact and draw from the expertise and capabilities of the universities, private sector, et cetera, right? And this matters. This matters because you get real differences in the outcomes based on the political leadership that are offered. And so I offer this one image of a comparison of Kentucky versus Tennessee, right? So two states that are side by side geographically that reacted quite differently to the outbreak of the coronavirus, with Kentucky moving much earlier, declaring a state of emergency on March 6th, Tennessee not doing so until about a week later, and similarly a lag of about a week or so, maybe even 2 weeks, on closing schools in the two states, with predictable consequences in terms of the number of confirmed cases that we're now seeing in Tennessee versus Kentucky. Even though Kentucky did as much or more testing than Tennessee did. And so we're seeing quite a stark difference between those. I should note that at least the last I looked on the news, what we hadn't seen yet was a big difference in terms of the number of deaths in the two different states. And that could just be because deaths are a lagging indicator, and that could be what's going on, but it might also be that there's something wrong with the data measurements here. And so I put a caveat at the bottom of the slide for not only this one, but for all of what I'm going to talk about today. Much of what I've drawn from are what I consider to be reliable sources off of the internet, but nonetheless, in this moment, speed trumps independent verification of the data, and so I put an asterisk beside everything here. Okay, let me give a little bit of history and context for this disease, and then we'll talk about politics and economics. And so I love the visual of this particular image that puts the casualties, unfortunately, associated with pandemics going all the way back to the Roman Empire, right? So this is historical patterns. And so near the top of the graph, you've got farther back in time. You can see kind of near the top is that the Black Death, right? So the big sphere, this sort of spiky sphere in the middle there, associated with 200 million deaths. And because of the visual perspective of the graph actually distorts this a little bit, because if that was closer in time, you can see that as a number, 200 million, that's actually much larger than the Spanish flu or HIV/AIDS that are closer in time, the red and green spiky balls. But it puts in perspective that there have been some very large pandemics in the past. And of course, we don't know how COVID-19 is going to rate ultimately on this historical scale. Obviously, the figures that are used in this graph as of March 11th rather, they're already wildly out of date, right? So the worldwide death total is now over 40,000, so that's 10 times what is given in this graph. And so we'll see how this works out, but I think it shows already that many of the experiences that we have in our lifetime, right? So SARS and Ebola that made a lot of headlines, they actually pale in comparison to what's going on now with coronavirus. Okay. Then, of course, you get very different national experiences, and South Korea in particular has stood out as kind of a success case in terms of being very proactive in testing its population and isolating those who are affected by the disease. Whereas other countries, unfortunately, including this one, the testing has not gone so well, and the US is on a very high trajectory where the number of cases is doubling rapidly. I'm not sure whether, this graph suggests it's between 2 and 3 days. I don't know if that's still the case, but it's definitely been moving very, very rapidly. Okay. There's a video here that actually compares the pace of recent pandemics. So comparing, for instance, COVID-19 to SARS and others. I won't watch it right now, but we might be able to do that later on. It's worth noting that experts have been talking about this risk for some time and saying, look, we should get ready. We are now in such heavily interdependent, connected world that this kind of risk is something that we can foresee. And they weren't listened to, obviously. And in a day, so for today, for instance, one of the headlines in the Washington Post was that the National Strategic Stockpile of PPE, right, personal protective equipment for medical personnel, is running dry. We're running out of that equipment. And so it's exactly at this moment where you think, wow, if only we could go back in time and have paid more attention to the warnings that we were receiving. Now, of course, there's multiple reasons why experts weren't getting their message across in the sense, well, they got the message across, but it wasn't prompting different actions, different behavior. One is that, of course, the experiences of SARS and some of these other plagues were not so bad, and that politicians could be, in some sense, forgiven for thinking, oh, well, that's a problem for other countries, or if it does get here, we'll be able to deal with it. And now, of course, we're seeing something very, very different. But even accounting for that, I think we have to recognize that in this country, especially, and to a certain extent, we've seen this in Britain and maybe elsewhere in Europe as well. I'm not sure about other parts of the world, but there has been an undercurrent of anti-expertise, of movement away from trusting in science, trusting in professionals who have spent years studying a particular problem. And so that's affecting politics. And we're going to talk a little bit about that now. So I'm going to do that section, and then I'll pause and take any questions that you might have. I teach this course on the politics of globalization, and two of the recurring themes that I have in that course are the ones you see on this slide. And so I couldn't help but relate what's happening in coronavirus to these two themes. One theme is that markets are inherently political structures. And we see this kind of in spades right now, where industries are coming to governments and seeking bailouts or loan guarantees or various supports, payroll supports. And also, so those are deeply political decisions, and there's no avoiding them, because on some level, when an economy is in real crisis, it's all very nice to say that, well, we should just let some companies go bankrupt. And in fact, probably some companies will go bankrupt. But letting the whole system collapse is not something that a political leader can stomach and expect to be still in office in a year or two time, right? So that's just not a possibility. Pharmaceutical testing has also become political. And of course, this is very difficult times for agencies like the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, that has to make decisions about the balance of risks associated with moving new or unproven remedies, vaccines, tests, moving those ahead, and all of the risks that might come with expedited procedures versus the risks of not doing that and doing the slow, laborious process of fully testing and vetting various medical devices and drugs, and therefore slowing the day where we have maybe a vaccine or a treatment or both for COVID-19. So those are difficult decisions, and of course, politicians weigh in on that, right? We've seen President Trump on Twitter weighing in on that, and there are others. Another recurring theme of globalization is that governments have not figured everything out, right? So they're continually experimenting with economic policy and with policy generally. And so one way of seeing this, I think, is the sort of initial United Kingdom approach to the disease, to the pandemic, versus the approach it's using now, right? So the difference between, I think the terms being used were mitigation versus suppression, right? So the idea that the initial approach was, let's let people get exposed to the disease, and some people will therefore develop immunity to it, and we'll get kind of this idea of herd immunity, and therefore build up a body of people who are resistant or immune to the disease. But as epidemiologists, particularly at the Imperial College of London, started to figure out, well, what would that actually mean in terms of the number of deaths necessary to make that happen when large parts of the British population were exposed? The costs of that, the human costs, right, the number of deaths associated, was just too much for politicians to stomach. And so there was a remarkable shift in policy, where instead of saying we're open for business, the British government said we're going to lock down, and we're going to close schools, and we're going to change things. Some version of this degree of variation of government response continues in different parts of this country and around the world, right? So Sweden in particular is continuing with the approach that, we don't have to lock everything down. We don't have to close everything down. We can ask our people to try to stay home as much as possible and leave it at that, right? And so that might work in Sweden, where, Swedish people are generally trusting in their government and have high levels of social awareness and individual responsibility. In this country, I'm not sure that the same norms and ethos actually apply, and we're seeing really big differences state to state. Obviously, New York to Florida is one comparison one might make in terms of the strength of the lockdown and the degree to which governors and mayors have decided to go after this public health threat. So that's all on the public health side. There's also been really big shifts in the economic policy too, right? And so initially the United Kingdom suggested a £30 billion stimulus bill, and 6 days later it was talking about 10 times that amount, right? So really starking difference. Same here in the United States, where Congress just recently passed a $2 trillion bill to encourage business activity and to support many businesses that are going out of business, or at least are threatened to do so, and people losing their jobs. And that kind of stimulation, right, $2 trillion bill, that wasn't even a political possibility even a month ago. Right? Okay, so as I said earlier, ideology matters for how we see this crisis. And I think it's worth being aware of your own ideology and try to at least empathize and see where other people are coming from, and to try to compensate for the blind spots that we might have, right? Because everybody's got them, right? We all have ideology, and that means we all have blind spots. And so seeing how, for instance, conservatives and progressives see the issue in wildly different way, right? With untrustworthy media versus kind of the package of progressive policies that progressives have wanted all along. They just see this as kind of more impetus than ever to having things like paid sick leave or universal health care. And then never mind kind of left or right on a domestic scale, you can also see kind of open versus closed on a international foreign policy dimension, right? So people who are more interested in globalism see the need for international cooperation, the World Health Organization, cooperation between central banks in the world, that sort of thing. On the flip side, you see kind of anti-globalists seeing the risks of global integration and openness, open borders to people, to trade, coming to the forefront. And it's not just, risk of people who might be carrying the disease coming in across, although of course that is there too in more or less xenophobic versions. But then there is, in addition to that, real concerns around pharmaceutical supply chains and what kinds of hoarding different countries might have over scarce resources, whether it's pharmaceutical drugs or medical equipment, or soon we're going to be talking about the food supply chain. And the UN FAO, right, the Food and Agricultural Organization, has already warned of food shortages that should start to appear later this month. And so that's something to keep an eye on. It's obviously very nervous for all of us. As I said, the issue of trust in science, I want to emphasize that I don't see this as a partisan issue. And this is something that has existed both on the left and the right in this country, right, where you have an anti-vax movement that is particularly strong on the left wing, but it's there on the right as well. On the right, we see all kinds of mistrust in science around the issue of climate change, human evolution, etc. And in Europe, there are different versions of this as well. There's some anti-vax movement. There's also a societal difference in how much trust there is for genetically modified foods, right? GMOs, genetically modified organisms. That issue is complicated. Genetically modified food is, there's a precautionary principle, so there's some justification for that. I don't want to say that it's simple or that people just don't understand science. That's not what I'm saying. But there is, I think, a complicated relationship here between scientific experts, and the trust that they have with their society. This graph, I think, is quite striking, showing the degree to which early on in the pandemic, the beliefs about the seriousness about the coronavirus were characterized by party affiliation in the United States, right? So the Democrats generally thought this was much more serious than Republicans did. And that was true, all over the country. Didn't matter which state you were looking at. More recently, actually just yesterday, there was a great piece in Vox that highlighted some research by colleagues of mine, not here at Brown University, but elsewhere, showing that you can measure a lot of different factors and almost nothing is as strong as partisanship for people's belief about the coronavirus. And over time, of course, we're seeing, I think, some shift in that, right? So that there's some convergence between Republican and Democrats' beliefs on that. But the key factor here for that convergence is that Republican elites, including President Trump himself, are changing their tune, right? And so it's not that necessarily that the sort of facts on their own distinguish how people should view the issue. Okay, so all kinds of knock-on political consequences. I'm going to do this very briefly, but one thing that caught my eye that I think is important to pay attention to is how this is affecting the rule of law in this country and in other countries, right? So in this country, the Department of Justice requested to Congress a suspension of due procedure, of being able to hold people without arrest warrants indefinitely. And it's not clear that request is going to be granted by Congress. In fact, I think it won't be, but it is already one indication of the kinds of changes that we might see. I think we're seeing that kind of concerns around due procedure even more strongly in, say, Hungary, right, which has just declared a national state of emergency with no end, and indefinite state of emergency, which is a real concern, given that the politics of Hungary were moving in a more autocratic direction even before this event. A second kind of knock-on consequence we might worry about is sort of the rise of white nationalism, or more generally extremist ideology. More time in isolation that we're all experiencing means probably more online time for most of us on average. And then for a very small fraction of us, that is going to mean more exposure to the kind of dark corners of the universe, where of the internet, where you see really extremist beliefs being propagated and taught and shared, including kind of white nationalist texts. And so that might be a real concern going forward. Experts that are, I'm not an expert on this issue, but those who are very much concerned that that's a possibility. We might also see risk to elections, and many political scientists have already flagged the importance of preparing for an unusual election, a potentially disrupted election in November, and the need to go ahead with a general election in this country, regardless of the public health situation, because there are other ways of managing the vote, right? We can vote by mail, we can do other things, but that takes time, it takes preparation. And if the preparation doesn't happen soon, then understandably, it's going to be more of a chaotic scene and less representative scene in November. And so that's something that we need to keep an eye on. Already we've seen state primaries canceled, particularly on the Republican side, where there is a balance here between the health risks and the importance of having the elections. It's, I think, to my mind, less important in a Republican primary, where it would be shocking if the incumbent president wasn't the nominee of the Republican Party. So I'm less concerned about those, but I am much more concerned about the general election, because this is the kind of thing that might provide the pretext for either a postponed or suspended election. And that's obviously very, very concerning for democracy in this country. We'll also see other kinds of knock-on consequences, a backlash against globalization. We've already talked about a little bit about sort of those who see the risks and concerns and the value of having a self-sufficient country. That's going to make people, to a certain extent, less inclined to integrate globally. And then there might even be risks to social cohesion, particularly if we get food shortages. This could be, well, there are real risks around that. I'm not even going to spend too much time on that, because I think it's very gloomy, but I think it's worth highlighting this article written in Foreign Affairs by Branko Milanovic, who talks, he's an expert on inequality, and he flags some real concerns around what extreme shortages might mean for social unrest and for violence in this country. Okay. So just coming back to that idea of the importance of a government bureaucracy that is competent and that is capable, this stands, it has to be said, in tension with what has been the traditional message of the Republican Party since the Ronald Reagan presidency, right? So Ronald Reagan, in his inaugural speech, said that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. I would like to think that Ronald Reagan would not have tried to express that message about this particular scenario, because this is a very unusual scenario. But it is worth recognizing, I think, that the reason we have government is in part to protect us and to ensure societies against grave threats, whether they are external invasions or pandemics or other kinds of concerns. And so this is an opportunity, I think, for the United States and for other countries to have a conversation around what is the proper role of the state. And that conversation is really important because it can't just be, let's expand the role of the state, because that could be taken in all kinds of threatening, dark ways as well, right? And when I say threatening, I mean undermining civil liberties. So it can't be just kind of blanket expansion of the state, but it also can't be just starving the state and shrinking it down to the minimal size, because then we are maximally exposed to these kinds of risks. On an international level, there's all kinds of political dimensions to this as well. I'm going to highlight a couple here. One is the idea of Russian and Chinese disinformation campaigns. This is unfair in some sense to highlight just those two countries, because other countries have done it as well, but Russia and China are great powers in a way that other countries aren't. And the European Union and the New York Times in this country have laid out accusations saying, look, we have evidence that these disinformation campaigns are ongoing and that they are being supported by the governments in these countries. In addition to that, there have been a certain amount of analysis and op-eds by Chinese authors about the vulnerability in the pharmaceutical supply chain in the United States. And so that's a real concern, because without actually quite saying, let's take advantage of it, there was a very clear implication that China has a certain amount of power here in this kind of crisis situation, which would be, obviously very threatening. And fortunately, we haven't seen any movement in that direction. And in fact, I think the Chinese authorities have disavowed that idea altogether and have gone the other way. And I'll talk about that in just one more sec. But let me just finish the thought on this. I don't want to say that this is just about Russia or China by any means, because the United States itself has been playing the kind of power politics game. President Trump and others have been looking both to sort of shift blame and to use opportunities to project American propaganda on the issue as well. On the more positive note, there is, I think, elements of international cooperation here which are quite heartening and which offer opportunities for countries that are entrepreneurial and that care about their prestige, their status in the world. So for instance, the World Health Organization, of course, is kind of a crucial body that facilitates cooperation. They are limited in the degree to which they can support medical interventions and or influence the way states decide on their lockdown procedures, because of course member states don't take orders from the World Health Organization. And the question here on the slide is, why does it struggle? It struggles because it has no enforcement capability, right? It can't make a decision at the WHO and expect that member states will take orders from afar. But nonetheless, it plays a crucial role as a key provider of information and as an authority that has some legitimacy when it says, look, we have a real problem here, right? So when the WHO declared this is a global pandemic, that made headlines around the world. You also see at the national level, different countries kind of vying for international cooperation as a tool for prestige, right? So China sharing its equipment with the European Union, with Africa, Cuban doctors going to Italy to help out, Russian doctors going to Italy, and of course, gaining the headlines that come with that. And then South Korea in a race to try to ramp up its capabilities for testing of the disease and sharing those tests with the rest of the world on a no profit or low profit basis as a way of showing that it's appreciated and then plays this kind of a crucial role even as a middle power in world politics. Of course, there's a little bit of a sting to that one as well, because not so long ago, President Trump was asking South Korea to pay billions of dollars for the U.S. troops that were there in South Korea and playing a protective role. And so when the U.S. government asked for more medical equipment from South Korea, the South Korean government responded by saying, we will make available what is surplus, and certainly didn't offer any additional benefits to the United States, and understandably, because this is where the goodwill that a country like the United States earns in peacetime and in normal situations, it really matters, because you want that goodwill as an insurance. So one thing I would just say as a kind of precursor is that there was a great discussion between Ed Steinfeld and Mark Blythe at the Watson Institute, an event yesterday that you can watch on YouTube. I watched it last night. Just a fantastic discussion about how to think about this problem. They had very different things to say than I have right now. Not that we're disagreeing with each other, but we just have there's so much to talk about. And so we're just going to focus on slightly different topics. One thing, just to that's a sort of broad brush first instinct on this is say, okay, what is the size of the shock that we're talking about here? I'm going to start with the United States impact. The figure on the left shows unemployment claims, and what's striking about this is that the graph goes all the way back to 1967, right? So this is a lot of history here, and what we're seeing, just in the last couple of weeks is totally unprecedented in terms of the scale and the speed of unemployment, and so this really represents, on a human level, just it's heartbreaking to see this many people let go of their jobs, and of course that's going to have a ripple effect. You see the spike now, but the consequences are going to be something that unfolds for many months to come. On the right-hand side, of course, you can see stock market reaction, which also fell. It fell, much sooner. It came earlier than the unemployment numbers came. But then what you see actually sort of, I don't know if you can see this very close to the right-hand side of that graph, is a kind of a uptick, a rebound in the last 8 days of March of like 15%, which is a pretty sizable amount in a stock market movement. And that certainly has multiple causes, but probably the biggest one is that stimulus bill passed by Congress, $2 trillion, so huge amount of money, about 10% of GDP, introduced at least over a stretch of time, but introduced as some sort of forthcoming to the government, forthcoming to the economy. And so businesses were reacting to that bit of good news from their perspective, that there was hope that the economy would recover sooner rather than later. Whether that is going to be sufficient is very much unclear, and I would say most economists would argue that even though $2 trillion sounds like a huge amount, it's probably undersized for the scale of the shock that we are experiencing now and will be experiencing for several months to come. Okay. In addition to the congressional, well, I call it stimulus here, but stimulus is really the wrong word. It's a rescue package, right? It's not like this is a normal, business cycle downturn. This is a different beast altogether. But in addition to that, right, so roughly $2 trillion associated with Congress, there's also been very strong moves by the Federal Reserve, which has on its own authority released in different ways, right, with quantitative easing, bond purchases, swap arrangements, but in addition, a huge amount of money, the final tally of which is something we'll do in retrospect, but it includes at least $1.5 trillion over the last month. Okay, Then, of course, there are multiple crises going on here, right? So let's not lose sight of what we talked about earlier about the oil price crash, which is for some countries good news, the ones that are major importers. For other countries, it's bad news. It's going to hurt the producers very hard. In this country, it's very much a mixed story, right? So because we have both producers and consumers, and I think the overall speed of the change is what's going to be the most difficult part. Because even though it's great that you know, it costs less money to fill up a tank of gas, that's not exactly going to change behavior when there's lockdown for a huge part of the U.S. population. So the economic benefit isn't being absorbed right now, whereas all of the costs in terms of the damage done to oil-producing companies in the United States, that's front and center right now. And so on net, I would say that this is quite a negative impact. All kinds of really interesting questions here about the degree to which there is going to be collaboration between central banks in different countries. And this crisis, just like the last financial crisis in 2008, is revealing the extent to which global finance rests upon the US Federal Reserve, right? And that's something that other countries kind of wrestle with. They're not so sure that they want that to be true. But the fact is that something like 60% of foreign reserves around the world are in dollars. 60% roughly of global transactions are in dollars. And so during times of crises, investors who want stability, right, who want to store value, they don't want to lose money, they're not fleeing to, you know, minor currencies, they're fleeing to the US dollar, which they hope and trust as safe, right? And so that creates a huge demand for federal dollars, or for US dollars, which is a problem for the liquidity of the banking system. And so that means that very often other central banks, like the European Central Bank or the Bank of Japan, Bank of Canada, they don't have enough US dollars to provide to the private banks in their own system. And therefore they have swap arrangements, currency swap arrangements that they can make with the Federal Reserve under these kind of emergency conditions where a huge amount of money is authorized, sometimes unlimited amounts of money are authorized by the Federal Reserve to swap with the central bank. It's got those arrangements with 14 central banks. It doesn't have it with everybody, right? So what about China and Russia, for instance, who are two countries that are not part of the 14? And when Adam Tooze wrote this article just 10 days ago, it was very much unclear. The answer has somewhat cleared up because yesterday or the day before, sometime very recently, the Fed announced a different kind of mechanism that would allow any central bank in the world to access US dollars. And so in a very real sense, the Federal Reserve has said, we are the lender of last resort for the whole world, not just for the United States, but for the whole world, the whole global financial system. And that creates this really interesting tension between a highly internationalist Federal Reserve and America First president and federal government, you know, an executive. And so that tension about, you know, where does the U.S. federal government actually land is unclear, it's complicated, and it's in tension with itself. Okay. The Department of Homeland Security has designated a series of sectors as kind of critical infrastructure. And so this informs the governors and the mayors who are thinking about how to do lockdowns. Their thinking is affected by lists like this as to who to allow as exceptions to the lockdown, right? So when we talk about critical or essential employees, what do we mean by that? And that's a discussion and conversation we're having in real time and trying to answer. Oh, it turns out that truckers are essential employees, and they're getting recognition in a way that they didn't get necessarily a couple of months ago, pre-crises. And so that's worth really paying attention to. And when we talk about, say, creates all kinds of political tensions, right? When we say that, well, a $15 minimum wage is illegitimate and we're not going to have that. And yet those same people who would benefit from a minimum wage of $15 are now being classified as essential employees. Well, how do we square that in our minds? How does that make any sense politically? Thought I'd just flag some of the conditions that Democratic politicians here, I'm highlighting Elizabeth Warren's proposal. These were the types of conditions that people were focusing on to make the package, the economic rescue package of $2 trillion, not just a blank check to whatever the executive branch wanted to do. And so that there had to be some conditions around this, and in particular that the Democratic side wanted the money being spent to be focused on workers and on families and on hospitals and on cities and state governments, and less so on corporate bailout. And so ultimately there was a compromise between those, and so everybody got some amount of money, but there was a real tussle here about how that money should be spent. And of course, it raises those interesting questions, particularly for, say, cruise lines that were not even officially headquartered in the United States or flagged in the United States, and had been benefiting from differential tax treatment in Panama or Cayman Islands or wherever, now asking for bailouts in the US system. Well, that's politically hard to take for the Democratic Party. Republicans in general more supportive of that, although even there was pushback on it from some quarters. In the EU, you've got really interesting realignments as well. Germany has traditionally been a country that is keen on fiscal balance, right? So low deficit or no deficit. It's changed its tune very much, right? So it's now very much in the business of stimulus. And to a certain extent, Germany has shifted its perspective on collective economic insurance for the whole European Union, right? And so Germany is willing to back the ECB movement to have a $750 billion bond purchasing program, but it has not been willing to go beyond that. And there are some countries, particularly France, that have been pushing for that kind of move. And so we'll see. And I highlight this Eurobond initiative because some of my colleagues, Mark Blythe included, were pushing European governments. They wrote a letter signed by something like 500 economists and political scientists, encouraging European leaders to take seriously the idea of having Eurobonds rather than just national bonds, right? Italian or German or French or Danish bonds. Okay, and then of course there's the issue of supply chains, and in the United States, the Defense Production Act has received a lot of attention. It's an interesting act because it was passed in 1950 in the context of the Korean War. It allows the federal government to reprioritize private companies' operations, right? So that it basically mandates that private companies have to accept federal contracts and produce the goods under that contract first, right? So to make the federal government first in line for its customer base. This is routinely used, and so in some areas of the economy, this is used all the time by the Pentagon in particular, And so it's not like President Trump hasn't used this act. He's used it many, many times, maybe not him personally, but the federal government during his administration. He's proven very reluctant to use it for medical supplies in this crisis. Ultimately, he did make an announcement to try to push GM, but only after he was pushed by Democratic leaders for some time about that. It's unclear exactly what the source of his reluctance to use that is, but time will tell on that question, I expect. Okay, there's probably more to say on this issue, but I'm going to stop now.